When the Strait of Hormuz effectively shut down on February 28th, almost everyone assumed the global economy was going to hit a wall. 150 oil tankers were suddenly stranded outside the strait, paralyzing a narrow waterway that handles 20% of the world's daily oil supply. Prices spiked past $100 a barrel, and gas prices in Canada jumped 40 cents a liter in just 3 weeks. Major manufacturing hubs in Asia were suddenly looking at a catastrophic fuel shortage. The International Energy Agency called it the largest oil supply disruption in history. South Korea usually gets about 70% of its oil from the Middle East, and practically overnight they were cut off from the fuel that powers their entire manufacturing sector. But looking at the actual trade data, something really interesting happened in the background. The countries facing the absolute worst of this crisis didn't scramble to find different suppliers in Europe or Russia. Instead, they quietly made phone calls to Calgary. It is important to look at what refiners in Asia actually needed to survive this. They needed oil that was priced competitively, available immediately, and most importantly, didn't have to travel through an active conflict zone. And it turns out Canada was sitting in the exact right position to provide it. Official government data released this week confirmed that Canada's refined petroleum sector just posted its highest production year ever in 2025, hitting 117.1 million cubic meters. They have broken their own production records for 3 consecutive years. At the same time, crude oil production averaged 5.3 million barrels per day. This all happened while the global energy market was in complete chaos. Because the Trans Mountain pipeline is currently running at full capacity, Canadian oil can be loaded onto tankers on the West Coast and sent straight across the North Pacific. The Pacific shipping route covers nearly 9,000 kilometers, but it bypasses every major geopolitical choke point on the map. It offers a highly secure, reliable path directly to buyers in Asia. Chinese buyers recently became the pipeline's single largest customer, and South Korean refiners, desperate for reliable supply that didn't require running a geopolitical gauntlet, immediately activated emergency plans to bring in Canadian crude. This massive surge in Asian demand is essentially reshaping how North American trade works right now. For years, the general assumption in Washington trade negotiations was that the United States didn't really need to rely heavily on Canadian energy. But the physical reality of the global market is painting a very different picture. Down on the U.S. Gulf Coast, American refineries are specifically engineered to process heavy crude oil. They typically source that feedstock from Canada, the Middle East, or Venezuela. With Strait of Hormuz closed and Venezuelan output unreliable, those American refineries are facing a serious shortage of the exact crude they need to keep running because Canada now has a direct, secure route to sell its oil to Asia at a premium. The leverage has completely shifted heading into the upcoming KSMA negotiations in just over 2 months. Canada isn't just reacting to tariff pressures on things like steel or auto parts. Actually hold the physical supply that both the Asian manufacturing sector and the US GF coast are actively competing for. There's also another major piece of infrastructure being decided on in about 6 weeks called the Prairie Connector Pipeline. If that gets approved, it would have the capacity to move about 450,000 barrels of oil down to the U.S. every single day. Having that tangible asset on the table gives negotiators a concrete offer for American refiners, creating a very practical kind of leverage. This shift also translates into making actual progress for the domestic economy. When a sector this large breaks export records, it gives people a sense of feeling in control of their financial future. Every major Canadian pension fund holds energy sector investments. When producers break records and oil trades higher, those funds perform better, which directly secures retirement savings. Provincial royalty revenues go up, which helps fund healthcare and local infrastructure without stretching the federal budget. It even provided the financial padding necessary for the recent 10-cent cut to the federal fuel tax at the pumps. It is a clear example of how economic leverage actually benefits everyday wallets. But the long-term picture requires a realistic view. Breaking production records generates a lot of immediate revenue, but it creates obvious friction with long-term climate commitments. Balancing this kind of heavy industrial output with targets for net zero emissions is a massive structural challenge, and the industry is still navigating ongoing domestic debates over carbon pricing. The current surge in demand is also heavily driven by a crisis that will eventually stabilize. Whenever the shipping lanes in the Middle East normalize and that traditional supply comes back online, some global buyers will naturally return to the suppliers closest to them. The pipeline capacity to the Canadian coast also has strict physical limits, currently maxing out around 890,000 barrels a day. So, the window to lock in these new global trade relationships and secure favorable long-term contracts isn't going to stay open forever. But for right now, the infrastructure that was quietly built over the last few years is doing exactly what it was meant to do. When the global energy supply chain broke down, the system simply found a new, more resilient path.